Good evening and welcome to our webinar, Driving and Tourette Syndrome, What Should We Know? My name is Angela Sullivan, Medical Project Specialist at the TIA, and I will be your moderator for this evening. This webinar is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association of America in partnership with the CDC. During tonight's webinar, we would be very happy to hear from you and include your voice in the conversation. You can ask questions or share comments using the question panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player at any time. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to mention that funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers this evening, Dr. Mary Monahan and Dr. Heather Simpson. Dr. Monahan is an occupational therapist, driving school instructor, and certified driving rehabilitation specialist. She has over 20 years of experience in driving rehabilitation and is recognized for her clinical and behind-the-wheel evaluation and intervention skills. She is founder of the nonprofit organization Driver Rehabilitation Institute. She has served as consultant on numerous federal projects and lectures extensively on topics related to driver rehabilitation and community mobility. Dr. Monahan is internationally recognized for program development in driving and community mobility for teens with special needs and has co-authored numerous publications in this area. Dr. Simpson is also an occupational therapist and adjunct lecturer at the University of Florida, UF Health in Gainesville, Florida. Heather serves as the Tourette Association Southeast Regional Centers of Excellence Coordinator between 6 research and academic universities across the Southeast region. Dr. Simpson has pediatric specialty from the AOTA and has been treating adults with children with tic and Tourette disorders. Dr. Simpson is an expert in occupational therapy management for tic disorders, as well as use of CBIT in the Southeast area. She has participated in multiple small research studies related to occupational and daily life functioning for those living with tic disorders. Dr. Simpson has been allotted opportunities for advocacy and training to occupational therapists, as well as other allied health professionals and management of tic disorders, including a chapter in 10 Secrets to a Happier Life with Tourette Syndrome. Without further ado, Dr. Monahan and Dr. Simpson, please go ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, for introduction, and thank you everyone for having us. We're really excited to bring this talk to you. I know it's a question that's been asked a lot, and I believe we mentioned it in a webinar last year and have had many questions since. So we're really lucky. I'm really grateful to be a part of this with Dr. Monahan. And using her driving expertise to hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have for your child with Tourette's or your loved one, your adult with Tourette's. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Heather Simpson, and I'm an occupational therapist who specializes in Tourette's, but not in driving, and that is what Dr. Monahan is on the line for, and she'll give us all of her special expertise. So the talk tonight is Driving and Tourette Syndrome, What Should We Know? Next, thank you. And Dr. Monahan is a co-developer of an app called Drive Focus. So she is disclosing that because that is an app mentioned in this presentation later. Next. The reason why we're talking to you about driving, not only is it because it was highly requested, but more as occupational therapists, our goal is to get you back and make sure people have the opportunities to engage in daily occupations, ranging from dressing, bathing, grooming, toileting, to being able to engage in school, to driving. So driving and community mobility is one of our specialties. We consider community mobility, it's defined as moving around in the community and using public or private transportation, such as driving, walking, biking, or accessing bus, taxi cabs, Ubers, or other transportation systems. So community mobility is a big umbrella term that we use to discuss how do you get around. And why is that important to us? Because we understand the importance of being able to have access to transportation helps with jobs, right? It's very difficult to get to a job when you don't have driving or Uber opportunities. Be able to feel independent, have social and recreational opportunities. We know teens are dying to go hang out with their friends and want to drive there without their parents dropping them off. Being able to get critical services, goods, foods, money, go get their medicine, and then of course emergency or medical services. We fully believe that without sufficient community mobility skills, individuals such as children with Tourette's are unlikely to reach their full potential. Next. And what you'll see here on the right is something that you'll see in those toolkits created by the Tourette Association and the CDC. On that far left column, you'll see what occupational therapists are, what components of Tourette syndrome that occupational therapists such as Dr. Monahan and myself are trained in doing. And at the bottom there, driving readiness. So that's what we're talking about tonight. Next, please. The outline for tonight, we're going to talk about the current research on teens and driving with a small little caveat on why Tourette syndrome might impact driving. Dr. Monahan will go over that there's really not much out there, and when I say not much, nothing out there about Tourette syndrome and driving, but what we know, the qualities and the symptoms of Tourette's and how it may impact driving. The steps needed to get ready to drive. So how do you know if your child's ready to drive? And then some resources for teen driving safety, and then of course some questions and answers. Next, please. Thank you.
Yes. So this is Miriam Monahan, and I'll pick up from here to talk a little bit about the current research. So the first thing we need to appreciate is that any new driver is at greater risk than any other age group in terms of driving crashes. So that those high statistics kind of carry over from the age of 16, which is where most states actually permit individuals to get a driver's license, all the way up until about age 30. So it is in those early years of driving that individuals are at greater risk for a crash. Whether individuals with Tourette syndrome are more at risk than their peers for driving crashes and violations is really unknown, as Heather already alluded to. There's just no research in Tourette and driving. But what's important to know is that there is research in conditions such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder, where individuals, where we have some idea of what might happen with those conditions, and those conditions, as all of you know, can sometimes also co-occur with Tourette syndrome. I like to describe this model. It's called the information processing model to describe driving. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is that I think it helps us inform our knowledge of how complex driving is. And then you can also use the lens of thinking about your child in terms of the skills that are required for driving. So you start up at the top of the green, number one, which is the stimuli in the environment. So in other words, let's just think about you approaching an intersection and there's a yellow traffic light. Well, at that yellow traffic light, you have to, step two, you are very quickly figuring out how far away you are from that traffic light color. You also are using attention to even notice that, for example, that there's a yellow light. And that's all part of it. And you need your vision and attention skills to get that. Then step three is you plan an action. So again, yellow light, well, there's many things that you go into thinking about. How fast are you traveling? How far away are you from the intersection? That helps inform you about whether you're going to hit the brakes or you're going to go through that yellow light intersection. And that's where executive functions key in. And then we go to executing an action. That's the actual physical response of either, in our scenario case, of maybe either hitting the accelerator or hitting the brake. And then you might modify those behaviors based on a couple of things. So for example, you might have checked the rearview mirror and realized that you had a tailgater directly behind you, which makes you realize that, I'm going to go through that intersection. Or maybe that there was a slippery roadway, so that you adjust your demands on the accelerator and the brake accordingly. This is just to say that these are how our physical systems in our body help us manage something as complex as driving. And so that if things like attention or executive functions or motor skills are something that you're concerned about with your child, that there is an indication that there might be some challenges with driving. But of course, that doesn't mean that somebody can't drive. It just means that somebody might need some extra help, and there's lots of decisions to be made as far as when the timing is right for learning to drive. In addition, there are many other factors that go into driving, and some of it, as you can think of, is what we bring to the vehicle when we get in. We all have different personalities, we have different cognitive capacities, we have different attitudes about driving, and the social aspects and the demographics that come in and bring a tribute to a driving style. So for example, an older adult is going to bring maybe a little bit more cautious behaviors than, say, a teenager will. But there's also personalities. Some people are more risk takers than others. Some people have different attitudes about other roadway users. And that can all present in a way that we can think of as our driving style.
Great.
Heather?
Thank you, Dr. Monahan. So now we're going to talk about some of those components that are part of that information processing model, but are really required for driving or any community mobility. And my role here is to kind of pose some questions and talk about my experience with working with adults and children with Tourette's, and saying how there may or may not be a correlation with driving or some concerns that we might have. So it's really a talking point. And one of those first areas is motor coordination. How in the heck do those motor tics interfere during driving? We know that driving success and safety is just as much of a physical activity as it is a mental and cognitive one, so attention or mood. With Tourette's, we know that oftentimes reflexively we have children and adults have increased reaction time, have no strength deficits. And so that's typically not a concern when we talk about a child or an adult with tics, is their motor capacity, their motor strength. But what we do know is that motor tics might interfere, right? So the coordination and the timing of the movements might be an issue. Does the ability of one have the ability to drive down a windy road as you see up there? Sure, with or without tics, we don't know. With tics, what happens if you're on that windy road and you have an arm jerk tic that comes out? Does it move the steering wheel? Are you able to hold that in? Maybe if there's a head jerk tic, what happens if you're let's say you're trying to turn left and you are turning left, but your head shakes or jerks back and it makes you go to the right. Are you in a safe enough place to do that? Oftentimes in my own practice, I see that many people with Tourette's really do a wonderful job of suppressing their tics when they're driving from a physical standpoint, even to the point that if they consider driving relaxing, that driving sometimes is where their tics are least likely to occur. But then, we do see some whose tics are triggered by things in the car or by driving. And so it's just a question to pose: what type of tics may your child have or your loved one have with tics? Thank you. Next one. And then we'll talk about social challenges. It's something that we don't really think about with driving, but why are there social challenges? We know that children and adults with tics are very observant to their environment around them, but how do we take in signs such as this one on the left? It's a literal interpretation. It says construction vehicle, do not follow. And is your child, is your loved one able to read that and say, okay, do not follow too closely, maybe I get in the left lane? Or is it do not follow, literally pull off on the side of the road? How literal will one take that? Is your child rigid with rules? Maybe some of the OCD is there. Or interpreting nonverbal cues. And this picture on the right is is an example of tailgating. So what does that mean? As Dr. Monahan said, is that something they're tailgating means they're too close behind me, so I should move over? Maybe I should go through the yellow light. What does that mean? Next, please.
All right. And then we're going to talk.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
We can also talk about visual search as well. A driver needs to scan the roadway efficiently and identify key information. We actually do that by mostly what we would call glancing eye movements. You scan around the driving environment. But at some point, and it's usually around the age of early 20s, that people actually are more efficient with directing their visual search. So for example, little kids will scan around the room, but it's not quite as purposeful and targeted as, say, a person in their mid-20s and older, where you have your cognitive functions to help you direct your vision. So teens in general are actually not particularly good at visual search. And that can be challenging with driving. They tend to take longer to find critical information on the roadway because they haven't developed that skill as well. And then another component of the challenges with those skills is that they might experience cognitive overload. In other words, just the more complex a driving environment is with a lot of visual information, teens in general can get saturated, sort of overloaded with the amount of information that they don't do as good as job processing what they're seeing. Heather, you have some points as well here.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things we do, there's some initial studies that have shown impairments in saccadic eye movements with children and adults with Tourette's. And what that means is the ability to jump to and from places in the same amount of time as maybe their peers. And that you'll notice that with reading. What happens if you have an eye movement tic or your eyes are rolling? Are you able to get back to your place and reading without much difficulty? But if we think about that in the car, will our kids with eye tics in particular be able to look at the dashboard, look at the rear view mirror, and then look at the road and then the sidewalk to make sure there's no passengers? And how do our eyes quickly move around to be able to take in multiple inputs? The other thing regarding visual searches that I often hear about is, let's say we know that tics have urges and they come because something internally feels it or a thought tells us that way. But let's say you are looking up, you have an eye rolling tic where your eye comes up and over to the right before your eyes close. Let's say someone who is driving has to check your rear view mirror and it's up and to the right. And so it's actually kind of mimicking that urge. It's the same movement as the urge. So do the tics increase when looking at a rear view mirror, for example? And that's different. Not everyone has an up and over eye rolling tic, but individually, how might those eye movements affect driving? Thank you. The other thing is a big challenge is what we know as executive functioning, and I know the Tourette Association has great resources on this, but executive functions allow the brain to plan, to organize, and complete tasks. One area that we might be able to see or recognize with driving is being able to see the big picture. So for example, in this picture of a Walmart parking lot, there's a ton going on. There's 3 cars all facing one direction. There's a pedestrian, there's a stop sign, there's shopping carts, there is a car coming right on your left. So what do we take in from this picture? If somebody has maybe some ADHD, are we distracted by the person walking so that we might not notice the person on the left? Or maybe we're looking for a parking spot, so we don't pay attention to the stop sign. And the reason why I say this is that a challenge with executive functioning can be seeing the big picture and breaking it down and being able to have multiple parts of attention. Dr. Monahan, I think this next one's you.
Okay. All right. And then we are also looking at the ability to prioritize a lot of visual information as well, and that's where executive functions come in as well. So this is actually an always stop intersection in Vermont where I used to live. And it's just simply an always stop. But if you look visually at the amount of information that's in front of you, it can be very overwhelming. But the key is that can the driver prioritize what they need to pay attention to first? And then traveling very fast through this roadway as opposed to the static image that I'm looking at right now, a driver would have to process that there's the stop sign, the lane marking signs. But in addition to that, there's also a young child or a young boy that's standing with one foot on the ground with his bicycle. There's also a person in the roadway. There's also a DMV vehicle, which is equivalent to a police vehicle that has a truck pulled over. There's oncoming traffic. There's oncoming traffic turning left. So again, seeing what is important for immediate reaction instead of maybe the things that are more stimulating and attractive to the brain. So instead of paying attention necessarily to those blue lights, that the driver is able to just focus on the first things first, and then prioritize back to looking at the rest of the visual information. So there's also a lot of other pieces that go beyond actually physically driving the car, and those are things like problem solving. How does your child work with problem solving emergency situations on their own? Maybe it's not a big deal at home, but maybe there's a light bulb that's gone out, or maybe the toilet has plugged up. Are they able to do some basic problem solving, even if that problem solving is calling the right people for help or recognizing a problem early on? Then there's also planning ahead and thinking about it in advance. It's not just the time that you spend physically driving, but it's also the person has to make decisions about when it's appropriate to drive. So if you're leaving for work and the weather's fine, but on the return trip home, the weather's going to be inclement, you need to think about how you're going to get home and whether it makes sense to even drive to work that day instead of getting a ride. There's also the mental flexibility that goes with being able to manage detour situations, such as what's imaged here, of that everything's moving from 2 lanes into 1 lane and requiring that mental flexibility maybe to make a change in the usual route. And then there's divided attention, being able to split your attention between multiple things. So as you're approaching the cyclist in the right-hand lane, you also have to be able to shift your attention to the adjacent lane to see if there's room to straddle the lanes. We're going to also talk about associated conditions that are commonly seen with Tourette syndrome, and I will turn this over to Heather.
All right, so hopefully you all are well familiar with the Tourette syndrome iceberg. And we briefly talked about parts of the symptoms underlying Tourette, such as executive functioning concerns and how that might impact driving, social communication deficits. But we're going to talk about a few things how the symptoms of possible OCD, ADHD might impact driving and what we know from research. Next. So let's talk about obsessive compulsive disorder. Although there's not any literature on obsessive compulsive disorder and driving, what we do know is that those intrusive thoughts and those compulsive actions can oftentimes be present in the car. And so some it might be present when even as a passenger. Oftentimes I have many of my parents say, you know, when I'm driving, my child feels like they have to pull the steering wheel, or they have to tap something. If the door is unlocked, I have to, they have a desire to open the door, so I have to lock the door. And so if obsessive compulsive symptoms are present, often it might interfere with driving. If you have a fear of parking too far away from a curb, or you have to have numbers or symmetry, how could that impact driving? Or some of those intrusive thoughts of fear of harming people increases anxiety around being around people, especially when you're in a vehicle such as a car, that can really do damage to someone unintentionally. So think about with obsessive compulsive disorder is think about how those obsessive thoughts, how that might interact with driving or create difficulties with driving. Next.
Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is one that can also be sometimes associated with Tourette syndrome, and those individuals typically have more difficulty with low stimulus roadways. So in other words, you're out on a country road, you've got not a lot to distract you, they're at more risk of getting distracted by internal thoughts, maybe by in-car controls such as the radio or phone, texting, and so forth. That can be more difficult on those other environments. But in addition, in more busy areas, they may experience more difficulty with prolonged driving because there's so many times that or so much energy they're putting into just redirecting their attention to the critical information that's happening on the roadway. Overstimulation can also make tics worse as well, and that can also be an issue in this more complex driving. Autism spectrum disorder is another one of those conditions that can be associated with Tourette syndrome, and the individuals that have autism spectrum disorder, there is some research in that area that is becoming actually quite a bit of research since 2011 in this area. And what they've discovered is that individuals with autism spectrum disorder typically require 3 times longer to learn how to drive. And they have their primary difficulties tend to be rigidity with rule following, problem solving, and hazard recognition. Anxiety can be another very common co-occurring condition which is associated with both Tourette syndrome and autism spectrum disorder. What we know from the research on autism is that learner drivers found that anxiety to be one of the greatest barriers to learning how to drive. Heather?
Thank you. Another big one, which we know is a big kind of challenge with those living with tic disorders, is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is defined as the ability of an individual to modulate an emotion, so essentially how to react to something that has occurred in their environment. And we know that this is often a really big issue with children with Tourette's. You might say that your child is quick to anger, or quick to frustrate or cry. But we know literature shows that positive emotional regulation, so being able to, if I'm upset, not necessarily cry or lose my cool, is really important and necessary for driving safety. Difficulties with emotional regulation, so being able to quick to anger or poor frustration, has been shown to influence risky driving behavior such as aggressive driving or speeding. And then also on our next slide, we're going to talk about this, but consider impulsivity with emotional regulation. So being able, if you're angry, do you quickly take a deep breath and calm yourself down, or do you immediately shoot them a bird, not tic related? How does that impact your driving? Next slide, please. Thank you. as I just mentioned, impulsivity. So not necessarily only impulsivity with emotions, but impulsivity with our actions, which is also a large concern with Tourette's. What we know is that impulsivity with emotions can oftentimes happen related to rage. But let's talk about, what about texting and driving? And your teen who is obsessed with their phone anyways gets a text message from their best friend. Do they immediately say, I'm going to pick up my phone, or are they able to say, I can wait, or put on the do not disturb? What about running red lights, running yellow lights? And the impulsive decision, which is part of that impaired circuitry with Tourette's, is often a concern. So risk-taking with driving has also been linked to thrill seekers. So impulsivity and taking big risk, thrill-seeking, is related to, can be linked to driving with high speeds, tailgating, racing, illegal passing, which we know are concerns with driving. Next, please. And then sleep disturbances. We know that children and adults with Tourette's, I think it's a number close to 60%, have a higher prevalence of sleeping disturbances or disorders. So difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, difficulty because of they're ticking too much in bed or their mind's active. And oftentimes the sleep disturbances are severe, that they might have insomnia and may only sleep 1 or 2 hours a night. And what we know is that sleep is a huge factor with driving. We know that 1 less hour of sleep can impair emotional regulation, so it can make you more prone to anger, more prone to be frustrated. But we also know inefficient sleep is associated with an increased crash risk. Not necessarily just falling asleep, but dozing, being more distracted, because those executive functionings aren't working when you're tired. Next, please. And then a big caution is driving and medications. Oftentimes, many of our children and adults with Tourette's are on quite a few medications to manage the co-occurring symptoms or the symptoms themselves. And some questions to ask is the side effect of the medication drowsiness? And is it real drowsiness that it really impairs their day, or maybe there are certain times where they shouldn't be driving because of that medication? Or is medication taken regularly? So let's say your child is on ADHD medication to help them with their attention. Do they stay on it during the summer, or they take weekend breaks, and how might that affect driving? It's similar to an executive function related to school. Another example, which I know related to medication, is marijuana, which is a topic that is for discussion, but those who are using marijuana regularly to manage their tics, we know that marijuana has been linked to impaired judgment, motor coordination, and reaction time related to driving. And so there are concerns if marijuana is being taken as a medication related to driving. Next, please. All right, so we're going to quickly go through some steps for driving, what we like to see as occupational therapists, to let us know that there are things like executive functioning, motor planning, timing, attention shifting that are all involved in some daily tasks that we do. And if we see those, then maybe it can make us feel a little bit better about driving, or vice versa. If we know that, for example, your child, you've tried to teach them how to do the laundry, but they cannot get it. They don't remember to do it. They forget to go back to the washer to take the clothes out and put them in the dryer. That might give us a little bit more of an understanding of maybe we should get some basic daily skills down before driving is started. So we're going to go through some of those. Some of those being responsible. It's important for teens to show that they're responsible for home chores, for their job duty, maybe taking care of a younger sibling or a pet, and maybe not alone, but necessarily if they're taking care of a pet, maybe their goal for the week is to be able to feed the pet and take him out to the bathroom, and that shows great executive function and planning and emergency preparedness. Or how do your child or your teenager interact with strangers, such as when you're in a new place, do they feel comfortable asking where the public restroom is? This also correlates what happens if they were to be pulled over when they're driving. How comfortable would they be talking to a police officer? Next slide, please. A question that we like to ask is your child able to be home on their own for several hours, right? Do you feel comfortable leaving them there? Do you feel comfortable that they can make safety calls? Do they know what to do in an emergency? Do they make good decisions? Do you feel comfortable with them making appropriate decisions, whether it's home safety or just not doing things that they're not supposed to do? Can they plan or prepare a simple meal, in particular, not just microwave, but with a stove or an oven? Because that asks the question, do they know how to use it? Do they know how to use something that is dangerous safely, or can they problem solve appropriately? What if they're out of an ingredient to cook? Can they come up with an appropriate substitution? And as Dr. Monahan said earlier, can they run an errand independently in a store? So would you give them a list of 5 or 6 items to get from a store with a set amount of money? And the questions to ask yourself, do they come back with the right amount of change? Did they get the right items? If their items weren't there, were they able to find appropriate substitutions? Next slide, please. Can they manage simple household chores or problems? So not only just difficulties with doing some of their own tasks, but can they, maybe if the toilet's clogged, can they plunge it? Or if the batteries are low on a TV remote, do they figure out how to do that themselves, or do they come to you and ask for help? And also really important is a great skill to have as a teen is being responsible for medications. Can they remember when their medication doses are up? Or when they're due? Can they remember, or can they ask you appropriately if they need a refill on your medication, right? Similar to, do they need an oil change on their car? Questions about medications and managing medications, it's important for your children to be able to be involved in that process. Next slide.
So we can think of community mobility as sort of like a hierarchy of skills where you first start as a passenger, and as Heather mentioned earlier, you know, is your child a good passenger? Do they grab the wheel? Do they get nervous about being in the vehicle? Those are all sorts of first stages for driving. Can they walk, not or be literally a pedestrian in a city environment and follow the rules safely to manage being a pedestrian? Have they used things like rideshare, like taxis, Uber, or Lyft? You know, it's important that we recognize that once a child is driving, they're actually very alone in the community. They're very independent in the community. So it's time to start transitioning them to being independent with alternative transportation, including things like buses or trains, and maybe even biking on the roadways. And when it comes to biking on the roadways, is having that ability to be aware of and understanding of the rules of the road and the perspective of other roadway users, such as drivers. And then the highest level after that is driving, of course. And so it's not to say that every child has to go through every single one of these stages to getting independent with community mobility, but it's certainly a good plan for us to keep in mind that this is sort of the natural progression of getting somebody ready for driving. Heather?
Thank you. So how was their car knowledge before even getting behind the wheel, right? It's so exciting to get behind a wheel, but there's a lot that goes on beforehand. So these are questions you can ask them when they're a passenger, things they can start thinking about, or just before even driving. We need to know that they know the basics about it. So do they know which way to go in a one-way parking lot, right? If it says you can go right, you don't go down the left one. Can they negotiate pedestrian and vehicle traffic? Do they know when one of those bright lights are flashing that means to stop even though there's no red light? Or are you comfortable with them crossing a busy street, taking a left? Can they tell you when you're driving? Can they help you out, say, as we're practicing driving, tell me when is a good turn to take a left out on this busy street? Or can I even take a left? And helping with those life skills beforehand is an important task for driving. Next, please. And then looking at, you can also look at their mobility on other devices prior to driving, right? So it could be a skateboard or a scooter. Did they tend to be clumsy? Did they tend to get in accidents? Were they impulsive? Did you have to tell them to slow down, be careful, don't jump off of the wall? Those can give you understandings of kind of what their driving skills might look like when they have anything with a wheel behind it. And then, as we mentioned earlier, are they able to grocery shop, go up and down the aisles, use a cart and use it appropriately? Do they stay on the right side of general traffic? Do they give people their space when they are using the cart to try to reach for an item? So grocery shopping is a great way to analyze these life skills. Next. And then, as we talked about managing emotions, it is a very easy discussion point, and I say easy with words of caution, but talking about managing emotions is critical before driving, and a good skill to have is learning how to regulate that emotion. If something doesn't go their way, how do they handle disappointment? How well do they handle that? And how that shows that that's a big contributor to driving, and it's important that managing emotions is done. Next, please.
So I'm going to talk about some resources because it's just helpful to know what's available to you on many levels. So one of the things that I'd like to show you is an app that I co-developed called Drive Focus. And I'm just going to play a little quick video that that illustrates what Drive Focus does. But what it specifically is targeting is it's targeting the skills that you need for visually searching the environment for key information and improving reaction speed for identifying critical information. So it really helps with executive functions as well as overall processing. So I will play the video here. Welcome to the exciting world of DriveFit.
Go through the training section to learn the critical items, how to prioritize them, and how to read your score. After completing the training, select a drive. The DriveFit app teaches you to recognize critical items on the road. Touch on the critical items as soon as you see them. The turn signal will let you know which direction the driver is turning. At any time, you can pause and review a quick reference guide and training. Your score will become higher with practice. Develop better visual search strategies for the road with DriveFit.
Okay, so it is called Drive Focus, by the way, even though the video said we changed the name at one point along the way. But the research on Drive Focus has already shown that if an individual, a new driver, uses Drive Focus for 6 hours, there's a reduction of driving errors, and specifically around visual search and improved reaction speed to changes in the driving environment, which can be important skills, as I mentioned, for any team, but it's particularly to give our individuals a little more experience, specifically with the cognitive part of processing driving and the visual search part. There's also, if you're looking for people like me that can perform basically what's called a comprehensive driving evaluation, as well as training, not just say full stop evaluation, but actually participate in helping you teach your child how to drive and actually help provide some training for your child. There's 2 resources that I'm showing up here on the web that would be resources that are available on the web. So the Association for Driving Rehabilitation Specialists, you can click on there and there's a directory that allows you to go into where you live and actually find a driving rehabilitation specialist near you. And then the American Occupational Therapy Association has a similar system in which to find an occupational therapist that can provide driving rehabilitation services as well. So even though it says older driver, it's not specifically only for older driver clients. There are also life skills training that's available. So as we mentioned earlier on, Heather brought up some important information that occupational therapists can help with really that pre-driving skills. When a teen is ready to drive, it's really often because they have built up and acquired the necessary life skills that get them in a good position in which they can be alone and problem solve in the community and be responsible for others and out there that are sharing the roadway. Also, speech therapists can be of great help. And then vocational rehabilitation departments that are available in any state, that they receive federal funding that help to promote and support any kind of employment in the future. So vocational rehabs can sometimes pay for driving evaluations as well as training if it's connected to the person's work. And then there's also the Center for Independent Living, and they can also sometimes help you with finding resources as well as helping provide funds for driving evaluations and training. And then the Center for Autism and Related Disorders can also provide more information, particularly around autism. Heather?
And this toolkit from the Tourettes Association is for when children or adults with Tourette's start driving. It's a nice little booklet to you could use it in a couple ways. One, keep it in your driver compartment, because what it does, it has information about Tourette's for law enforcement, and it's written in law enforcement language. And it has I have Tourette's card that says I have Tourette's. It's not something I can control. And the reason for these is to educate law enforcement, so you can share them with the local area or drop them off at the police station if your child is getting ready to start to drive, just so that they're aware of it. But also to help those who are driving feel more comfortable if they were to get pulled over and they might have a vocal or a motor tic, helps them. That card is easy to hand in with their driver's license to let them know, let a police officer know that they have Tourette's, and that maybe the movements that they're doing doesn't mean anything more than it's just that they have Tourette's. Next, please. And that's it.
So thank you. Yes, thank you all very much, and we'll be happy to answer questions.
Yes, please let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Monahan and Dr. Simpson. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during the presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the question pane in your control panel. If we are unable to get to everyone's questions here at the Tourette's Association, we have a full-time information and referral staff person who can answer your questions, as well as by emailing support@tourette.org or calling 1-888-4-Tourette, and we would be happy to answer any additional questions you have. Okay, so Dr. Monahan and Dr. Simpson, we have a few questions. I'm going to just read them off to you, and whoever feels most comfortable answering, you can go right ahead. So the first one we have a few years before our son is driving. Is there anything you can recommend that we do now to help him in the future when he begins to drive?
Heather, do you want to take that one?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I think a great way to start in general, and Dr. Monahan correct me with this, is those life skills that we talked about, talking about self-regulation, making sure emotional regulation is something that is well controlled, or they know how to manage. But starting with those, what we call IADLs, which are things around the house, chores, starting to be more involved in the cooking, maybe when you're driving, asking questions about how are they planning and seeing the environment. But we oftentimes recommend many years before driving, start those, make sure that your children are engaged in those life skills, is because those are big predictors and big correlation with driving. Dr. Monahan, you can answer anything else further that you see.
Yeah, I was just going to add, thank you for that. I was just going to add one other piece that really happens in this day and age is that teenagers tend to be not active passengers in those early years just prior to getting their driver's licenses. So we have so much technology that is distracting, such as phones and games and messaging and all of those kinds of things, that sometimes they're just not learning as a passenger. So I would really encourage in the couple of years prior to them driving that at least some of the time that they spend in the front passenger seat without using any distractors, and begin observing what you're doing as a driver.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question we have, for drive focus, are there settings to adjust for persons with color deficiency?
Good question. There are not settings for the color deficiency, but that is a good point. But it is films of real roadway scenes, so they're going to be what is consistent with what someone would see as they were driving. So that's just something to be helpful about. But the red circles that go around, that's a really good point. I think I will have to take that back to developers, and that might be something we need to think about as an option for a different color circle around the critical items. So thanks for bringing that up, much appreciated. We, just on that note too, that the app is available on iPads, and only iPads right now, but by the end of the summer, we will have an Android version that's available. And the price tag for Drive Focus is $9.99. Okay, so any other questions?
Yes, we have a few more. What accommodations would you ask the DMV for taking the written permit test and behind the wheel test?
So depending on the Department of Motor Vehicle state, you know, it's kind of interesting. In the United States, we have state level, states are actually responsible for their Department of Motor Vehicles laws and legislation. But if you go to Europe, they're pretty much from one country to another, they're identical in many ways. Have sort of all those. But it's hard to kind of give you a blanket information because every state is so different. But what I can tell you is that most states have some kind of accommodation for taking the written test. And those specifically can be things like you can have the questions read to you. And there sometimes can be allowing you more time, especially if it's on a monitor that moves the questions one right after another. But as far as the behind the wheel, I've never heard of any kind of accommodation other than using, say, adaptive devices such as mirrors. But otherwise, there isn't really any other accommodations that might be placed in, unless, again, it's adaptive equipment.
And if I can just jump on that, and I think the biggest thing that I tend to tell children who are going to the DMV is to educate their DMV testers on Tourette's and the fact that that tics are suppressible in some cases not. And so if your child does a really good job with driving, and the tics don't interfere. We've been practicing so there are times he might tick in between the driving, but like when he's at a stoplight, he might do a head movement, but it's nothing more than a tic that he's been living with X many years, and will not be interfering or should not be interfering. If you so believe so. But biggest part with Tourette's is educating them on the movements and the sounds, and that it's nothing to be afraid of, and that they've been dealing with it for a long time, and often know how to manage it.
Excellent point.
Wonderful, thank you. So the next question we have, my 16-year-old son has many eye tics with eye darting, etc. They get worse when he's practicing driving. Are there any specific tips that you can give?
So that's a great question. So we don't know any actual adaptations for the cars. I've talked to some people about learning how, instead of a rear view mirror, maybe use their side view mirror if that's less intrusive or less triggering for their eye tics. But the number one thing I do with my patients who have interfering tics with driving is I do the comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics program, teaching them how to manage the tics in a different way so that they're not interfering is the best bet I've had to that. And whether you do that with a one-on-one person or you do that through a tic helper or telecebit, it is very difficult to manage or accommodate the car or adapt the car, but learning those suppression or the competing response techniques is the best in those situations.
Great. So we have another question from a teen driver. So as a teen driver, I usually bring a fidget with me in the car just to keep my hand busy so my tics subside. Should I continue to do this, or will the fidget be a distraction that could possibly cause harm?
Ooh, great question. Dr. Monahan, I'll let you take that from like a from an ADHD kind of perspective, and then I'll jump in on the tic stuff.
Sure. You know, it's not, I think it's not out of the question if it's improving your ability to concentrate when you're driving. But what we might have to think about in a situation like that is that if you don't have two hands on the steering wheel at any given time, that can be an issue, particularly for safety. But in just a very practical perspective, the Department of Motor Vehicles is going to expect you to have two hands on the wheel. However, that said, if working with, say, a driver rehabilitation specialist, that one hand was on for example, a spinner knob, that would be, if it was something absolutely essential that you had, it could be actually written into your driver's license that you had to have a spinner knob so that the other hand could be off the wheel. Heather, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. From a tic perspective, I appreciate you doing anything that manages your tics. But if you have a co-occurring ADHD, that just adds in a little bit of a distraction. So first off, I'd be careful with what type of fidget you use. And I'm not opposed to it in any way, shape, or form. But think about what type of fidget. Is it a mindless fidget, something that takes some attention that you have to think about? But also, are there ways so that we know driving two hands on the wheel much safer? But is there a way that you can use that fidget that doesn't happen when you're driving versus maybe at a stoplight where you can do it for a quick 2 or 3 seconds and then go back to it? But if, from my perspective, and not a driving expert, from a tic expert, and if it helps you drive better, I'm certainly it's certainly a positive, not out of the question for sure. Any other questions?
Yes, a few more. So my daughter has narcolepsy as well as the other diagnoses mentioned. Do you have any experience with any teens who have had narcolepsy and driving as well?
Yes, I can actually talk about narcolepsy specifically. That's something that literally the doctor needs to consider for driving and have that discussion about whether the narcolepsy can be controlled in such a way that the individual can drive. Otherwise, if it's not really something that can be managed, it's typically a deterrent for driving. Heather, do you have something to add to that by any chance?
No, I'm sorry. I have no experience with narcolepsy and driving.
Okay. So we have another question. I think, Heather, you mentioned maybe are tic helper and telecebit apps. No, it's not necessarily relevant to driving, but I think, Heather, you must have mentioned that.
Yes. Did the question say what they want to know about it, or?
I think they just want to know if either tic helper and telecebit are apps.
Oh, are they apps?
Yeah.
TicHelper.com is actually a website, And tele-CBIT is telemedicine with a licensed professional who is certified in CBIT. So, for example, we have 2 here in Florida that are able to go via Skype and to do the CBIT virtually, and they have licenses across the country. And I know there's been some research on tele-CBIT, and it's hopefully coming out soon, but there are other people, if CBIT is not an option face-to-face, then tele-CBIT might be another option to help with some of those interfering tics, but neither of them are apps. One of them's a website and one of them's a person just on your computer.
Great. So we have 2 more questions. My son is 20 years old and still doesn't drive. He took driver's education and has his permit. However, staying in his lane and being aware of his surroundings, keeping a steady speed seems to be too much for him. Any suggestions?
I would suggest that maybe seeing somebody like a driver rehabilitation specialist to help with managing that. They might have some solutions for that as well. So we gave you some resources there for finding a driver rehabilitation specialist, but also feel free to reach out to me and I can see if I can help identify somebody in the field that would be appropriate.
Okay. So this one seems like it's from another teen driver. I sometimes put my left leg on the door and it does help with my leg tics, but my parents are concerned that it interferes with my ability to manage the speed and or state of the vehicle. Do you have any thoughts?
Can you repeat that first part again? Is using the left leg how?
They put it on the door, so I'm assuming that they prop their leg up on the side of the driver's side door.
It likely, I'm assuming likely decreases the urge for the tic so that the tic doesn't interfere. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I don't see any obvious issues with that. As long as the foot doesn't interfere with the pedals, with the position, the way you have it, it doesn't sound like an issue. But I also have to say is that if your parents are concerned about it, there's probably something they're seeing in that's worth having a discussion about, because they are obviously watching you drive and have some concern there. So that's worth having a discussion with them.
Great. Okay, we have one more question. I have epilepsy as well as Tourette's. Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with this? Both are fairly controlled. I just have been a little weary of driving. Or leery.
So, yeah, so epilepsy in and of itself has, some states have specific guidelines, for example, with when you're able to drive. And assuming that you have met the guidelines and your neurologist is okay from from feeling that your epilepsy is well controlled, it seems like it might be appropriate to do some driving and do some driver training. But also think about who's doing that driver training with you. If you're nervous, it may be more appropriate not to go to a traditional driver's ed program, but go to something that is going to be more geared to helping you learn at a pace that you're more comfortable with, as well as providing you strategies where it's appropriate. So somebody like a driver rehabilitation specialist may be of great benefit.
Right. And I would say from a Tourette perspective, I'm glad that it's well controlled, and just know I would check in with kind of those symptoms, the emotional regulation, the ability to manage impulses. So it might be, since we know impulsivity is an issue with driving, make sure that if you do start driving that you always have that do not disturb app on your phone, to kind of have those safe holds in place if you were to need them. But going through your, as Dr. Monahan said, whether driver training one way or the other, making sure that you feel safe behind the road is a really critical, or behind the wheel is really critical for driving. And so take the time that you need to feel comfortable and talk to experts like Dr. Monahan about getting adaptations if needed.
Great. We had 2 more questions pop in, if you guys don't mind.
Yeah.
So the first one,
That's
my son is 16 and is scared that his tics will interfere with future driving. What can we do to help his confidence while driving?
Do you want to start with that, Heather?
Yeah. And I want to be very careful because I from a tic perspective, I'll talk about that all day, but from a driving perspective, I'm going to leave that expert to Dr. Monahan. But from a tic perspective, I would show him how he's being successful in some of those life skills. So mention some of the things we talked about tonight. Emotional regulation is very important for driving, and you do a stellar job at controlling your emotions, making good decisions, or having, if they're an active passenger with you, giving that positive reinforcement. Wow, you did a really nice job of recognizing when to make that left turn in a really busy road. That's a really good skill to have. Or I feel comfortable having you go to the grocery store. You do a great job of going to the grocery store, problem solving. That's all very similar to driving. So, promoting the positives of things that they have, but I always fall back on the driving rehab specialist or the CDRS specialists about if someone's uncomfortable with driving, there are people out there that are designated to make sure you are safe and comfortable with driving, no matter what diagnosis you might have.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that too is if you're lucky enough to have a couple of different driver rehabilitation programs that you can access, you might look for one that also has a simulator, so that sometimes a simulator can be a great tool for helping to reduce anxiety, as well as just see how things go, test it out. But that to say, the person who's running the program is also key in many ways.
Wonderful. And lastly, Heather, will you just mention on how someone can get some more information on who does the tele-CBIT, if you know?
Sure. Tell them if you can email me, that I can help you find a specific person in your state. The Tourette Association has a Find a Doctor webpage, and I know a handful of people that do tele-CBIT, and I will tell you most of the time it is self-pay, as most states don't approve it for therapy at this point. But please email me. I'd be happy to help at least try to find you the right person.
Wonderful. Okay, that seems like all the questions that we have this evening. So I want to thank you both again for a great presentation. Once the webinar is closed, for those of you who are still listening, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would please complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of tonight's webinar. Additionally, the webinar will be posted on the Tourette Association YouTube channel for those who are unable to participate today. We encourage you to reach out to us on social media about this webinar or for other ideas and suggestions that you may have. On behalf of the Tourette Association, thank you again for joining us and taking the time to view our presentation. If anyone needs additional resources from the Tourette Association, like the pamphlets that Heather mentioned, feel free to email webinars@tourette.org, and we would be happy to send some out to you. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.